Hi everyone, welcome to this video on lesson 1 of the variation in inheritance scheme of work. This lesson is on theories of sexual reproduction, and really it's revisiting some ideas that we came across all the way back in the 5th scheme of work of the GLT shared curriculum that was covered back in year 7, the reproduction scheme of work. And I'll come to the kind of content of this lesson in a second. Before I do that, I think it would be helpful just to frame this whole scheme of work so that you've got an idea of where it's going as teachers. So this scheme of work was not planned by me for the most part. It was planned by Naomi Austin at Homely Park, lead practitioner of science at Homely Park in Gloucester. And the big idea that Naomi wanted to tie all of these lessons together with was this idea that as we build students towards this understanding of natural selection, an idea that we now probably take for granted because we've been so steeped in it, I suppose, but that for students is still probably just as radical as it was to the Victorians all the way back in the 1850s and 60s. The big idea of that's going to help them get towards natural selection is to think about the purpose of all of life and lots of the different things that we see in life being related to this purpose. The purpose of all life is to reproduce. It's to pass on our genes and continue the species. Now, this is obviously a really profound vision that Darwin had, and Darwin's idea was that everything that we see organisms doing, we need to somehow come back to how is this going to help their species survive. And you know, as you will know from your own reading and so on, this is an idea that has been taken on, and people have tried to explain all sorts of things with it because it's so profound. And there are questions as to whether this can explain everything. So one of the things I want to emphasize through this scheme of work is that this idea that the purpose of life is to reproduce, that is an assumption made by biologists or people who follow theories of evolution, so like evolutionary psychologists and so on, which is to say that we can't explain anything without thinking in terms of how does this benefit the species. So that's the idea that we want to keep getting across, that the purpose of all of life is to reproduce. So the reason for starting with this lesson, and this lesson is on sexual reproduction, is to just revisit what students learned about earlier. So really this just encapsulates what was covered in that sequence of lessons, and you can go back at scheme of work number 5 on the GLT shared curriculum on reproduction. And the big idea that tied together that sequence of lessons was the idea of fertilization. So what happens in this lesson, and I'm not going to draw a new diagram for this, I'm going to revisit the one that I did previously. There's a bit more detail in this lesson that Naomi's put in, and again, you can choose, depending on your class, how much detail you want to go into. But the big idea that we want to get across here is that previously, before we had ideas around fertilization and so on, we had this idea that I've attributed to van Leeuwenhoek, but actually it goes, as you can see in Naomi's diagrams, this goes back way beyond that. But the previous idea prior to fertilization was that essentially inside the sperm there was a preformed human being there. So you can see this is a kind of patriarchal type vision, and again that's something interesting. Our students are in year 9, you may wish to discuss with them. But there's this preformed human being, and during sexual intercourse that sperm is implanted somehow into the female, and the female is just there. She's just kind of a kind of vessel to grow this new human being, and this was widely believed and widely theorized by some very famous people. But what you can do is point out to students, well, if that was true, then you'd expect always to get identical copies. You'd expect to get all the offspring to look exactly like the father. But obviously, and again, this is where you can start with some questioning about what students know about inheritance before diving into this, but they will know that they'll have some characteristics from their mother and some characteristics from their father. So this idea that there's a preformed human being in the father which just grows inside the mother, that clearly doesn't seem right. And again, if you wish to go through all of the information that Naomi shared, around the discovery of egg cells and the observations that were made of fertilization taking place, you can. I've just kept this simple. This is in the diagram that I did for the previous scheme of work. But just to say, the modern idea is that actually there are sperm cells and egg cells, and what happens during sexual intercourse, not during every active sexual intercourse, but the idea for reproduction is that the sperm cell from the male fuses with the egg cell from the female, and then you get this process of gestation whereby cells reproduce and a baby starts to grow, and then eventually after 9 months the baby is born. And again, you can emphasize the idea that the baby will have characteristics both of the mother and the father, and that's how we get variation within the species, and that's what we'll look at in more detail within this scheme of work. So again, that's the purpose of this lesson, and you choose how much detail you wish to go into. If you want to just give a really simple contrast between preformation, which is this theory, and fertilization, which is this theory, that's absolutely fine. You don't need to name lots of scientists. That's not strictly necessary. And then, yeah, the final thing to just emphasize is that where is this building towards? Well, it's building towards this idea that this is how the species is continued through what we now know is through fertilization, through sexual reproduction. And where we're going to go with this scheme of work is to say everything that you see about organisms comes back to this. How can they do this effectively so that the species continues to thrive? And that's where we'll go in the subsequent lessons within this scheme of work.